We're interviewing Tom Towe in Billings, Montana. Tom, welcome. Would you begin by telling us a little of your political history? Tell us a little about yourself and how you got in politics and what you did.
Well, when I opened my law office in Billings in 1967, I was very interested in politics and in the legislature, and was very interested in what was going on in Montana. During my law school years, I was very active in working with the prison and a number of other areas. I organized the Missoula Public Affairs Council, and we had all kinds of programs on the radio and things like that.
That was in the early 60s?
And that was in the late 50s and early 60s.
Okay.
At the time that Jack Kennedy was elected president. And then, so I wanted to kind of get involved, and I ran for the legislature the first time I got a chance when I moved to Billings. And with that, I lost the first time.
And
but I ran again, and that would have been in 1968. I ran in 70, was elected, and served in the legislature. Only 2 Democrats out of the whole field of Republicans in the state legislature from Billings, from Yellowstone County. And then when the new Constitution came in 1972, at that point I decided to run for the Senate. And at that point we had single-member districts. I worked on the single-member district bill in the legislature, but we ended up with single-member districts, and so I ran for the Senate. And I've served 4 years in the House and 16 years in the Senate. Retired. I was unelected in 1994.
Does that mean you lost the election
That's right.
in '94?
That's right.
What accounted for that?
I lost.
Oh, do you know why you lost after so much
Well,
success?
It was a swing district, and it was always a tough area, and it was becoming more and more conservative and more Republican, and I lost. Now, I lost first of all in 1986. So I waited 4 years and turned around and filed again and beat my opponent in 1990 and served 4 years, and he came back and beat me in '94. I said, that's enough.
Well, I really appreciate your tenacity there. And, my father had the same situation. He lost in 1956 for the House, and came back. He lost by 2 votes, came back and won his seat again in '58. And the 2 opponents had run against each other 3 times in a row.
3 times. Well, that was my experience, and that's fine. And that always was, I think, a pretty good argument that we really don't need term limits. We have natural term limits. If the people don't like the candidate, they can get rid of them, and they can do it.
So what were the issues that especially concerned you when you were in the legislature?
Well, I focused on a number of issues. Probably the first major issue that I took on was utilities. I don't know whether you recall or remember or familiar with Lee Metcalf, who was very, very much involved in the utilities. The utilities was a big deal in the middle, well, the first half of the 20th century in particular, because they just dominated the state, and the Montana Power Company in particular. And I read some of the stuff that Lee Metcalf was working on, and I introduced a whole bunch of bills. The most important one was the Fair Value Bill. Lee Metcalf pointed out, and I thought he was absolutely right, that the whole way that you set utility rates in Montana was to look at to value the assets of the utility company, and they're supposed to get a fair rate of return. Well, if they get a fair rate of return, that means there's a percentage of the assets is like 8% or 12% or something like that is a fair rate of return. Well, the big thing is, what are the assets worth? And they would maneuver that so badly, and it got to be where we called it the fair value. They would go out and they would say, oh, that dam has a fair value of $10 million. Didn't matter if it only cost $100,000 or so to build many years ago. So we'll put it on the rate base, and then your percentage of that for your fair rate is that. And that's wrong. So I introduced the fair value, the bill to eliminate the fair value, and it passed. We had to make some adjustments, but we did get that bill passed. I also took institutional advertising out of the rate base. They always used to say all these ads which say, oh, the Montana Power Company is the greatest power company, and they do all of this and they do all of that. It doesn't have anything to do with utility rates. They're just trying to make themselves a better recognized company. And I said they shouldn't get a deduction for that. The stockholders should pay that, not the ratepayers. And that's what they do ever since my bill was passed in 1995. The thing that happened at that point, I think is a part of it, this wasn't my bill, but it came through with the new Constitution, is that we set up a utility commission, a public service commission, which we had before, but this time it was elected in single-member districts. And when you elect a public utility commissioner statewide, it's awfully easy for the power company to give them a substantial contribution, and they have to raise enough money to campaign statewide, and they don't really have a base because it's way down the ticket, so it just didn't work. You make it a single-member district, it's a much more democratic system. That was very significant also. And all of those, I think, as I maintain anyway, was a part of I have called it the silent revolution. We had a number of people who were very, very concerned about the direction that the legislature was going. And after the Constitution was adopted, and then during the time when, in 1974, in particular, in the 74 election, a whole bunch of us who were just terribly frustrated in the House because all of our bills would get passed and they'd get over to the Senate and they'd get killed. We said, well, we're going to change that. We all ran for the Senate. Most of us got elected. And that made a huge difference.
Okay.
And that plus, I think there was a growing concern about the environment. And I was involved in that, not nearly as much as others, like Dorothy Badgley, for instance, and a number of other people who were very involved in that. Darrow, Representative Darrow, and others. In any event, I think because of that we got a number of things done, and we did in 1973, 74, and 75 in particular. There was a huge change in the state legislature, and I was very much a part of that. So that and the utility rates was one of the main things. That was only one. Coal was also another one, and you perhaps are familiar with that and know about that, but the North Central Power Study came out in the very early 70s, 71 or 72, and they said that they projected we would have over 50 power plants in Montana burning coal for electric energy. And that would have a huge impact on the state. And obviously it would. And well, we said, hey, we better wait and see now. Let's check and see what kind of environmental laws we have that govern coal mining. We've got problems with eminent domain. There's most of the utility companies and other companies like that have access to eminent domain, and that's a big thing. Are we going to give that to coal developers too? How about the reclamation? We need to do something about reclamation. Well, we did. In the 1973 and 74 sessions, particularly as it ended up in the 74 session, that's the only time we had an annual session in Montana. This is 1974. They adopted it in the Constitution in 1972, and the people on an initiative said, "Oh, we don't want those legislators to meet all the time," so they took it away from us, and we ended up losing it. And 74 was the only time we had an annual session. So, but the 74 session was a major session with regard to coal and coal development. And we designed probably the best, clearly the most comprehensive reclamation laws that have ever been enacted anywhere, certainly in the United States. And it later became the pattern for the National
Tom, the
Reclamation
we
Act.
you're talking about were predominantly Democrats?
Now, the Democrats, I guess the we that I was talking about there is the Democrats, although it took the entire legislature to go along with it. We had a majority of Democrats in those years.
Did many Republicans or any Republicans vote for it?
Of course they did, and many did. Now, the most important thing, I think, and the most important part of that whole coal development was the tax, the coal tax. I started out, I was very impressed at some of the things that had been tried earlier to get coal tax. The coal tax was, I think, 5 cents a ton, and somebody tried to raise that to 10 cents, and I just got laughed out of the legislature earlier, and so I put in a bill for $1. And that didn't go over too well either. But I was pushing it, and I pushed it pretty hard. Well, that was the year where we had the annual sessions, and it didn't get through. We got it into a committee, and a legislative committee looked at it over the interim. And when we came back into the 95 session, I said 95, 75 session. I'm going to get my years straight. But when it came back into the 75 session, the committee had developed the bill and went along pretty much the lines that I had wanted. I had gotten a lot of input. They told me, well, you really ought to have a percentage of the FOB mine price, because that's how we lease the coal. We'll get a percentage of the FOB mine price, then we can figure it very, very easily. So I was the senior member of the interim committee, and that was back in the legislature in 75, and the bill was introduced. Then I got to introduce the bill as the most senior member there, but the committee didn't put in the number. What percentage should it be? And I put in 33 1/3%.
Oh.
A third of the FOB mine price. Well, and the bill started going through the legislature, and most of the Republicans opposed it, most of the Democrats supported it, but we had a lot of Republicans. Harrison Fagg, for instance, was a strong supporter, and others who were supporting it, and the upshot was we finally got it through in the 95 session. Now,
75.
75. Thank you. I get my dates mixed up. 75. We got it through in the 75 session, and at one time there was a big issue because they said, well, if you put coal tax at 33 1/3%, then if it sells for $10, then you add $3.33. Well, then you got to go back and figure 33 1/3% of that $3.33, and then when that gets figured in, you got another $9. You got to figure that out, and then you go on, and it's a pyramid. And I said, that's not a problem. We've got math. We got people that I don't understand it, but others do. They can figure out a mathematical equation. We can do that very easily. Not a problem. Well, we don't like it. So I said, okay, if you want it at the same, whatever you want, if you want to eliminate the pyramiding, and you want to put in a number, what number would you rather have, the pyramiding or a regular number? You take your choice, but it's going to be the same number, the same ending result. And they said, we don't want the permitting. So I said, okay, fine, 30%. And it went through at 30%. And that tax held. Unfortunately, after I was unelected, then it got reduced to 15%, and that's 15% right now.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
And then there was a question of the mine pricing.
No, not really, and that's always worked and worked very well.
Oh, has it?
Oh yeah, that's not an issue, and I'll give credit to that. It was the Montana Power Company lobbyist who came to me while I was working on the bill before we went even into to the interim committee, and said, you know, if you're trying to figure out a method of doing it, here's what you need to do. I did it, so it worked just fine, and it always has worked fine, and it is, and I think it set it set the tone throughout. But another part of that we probably also need to add is a very significant part, and that is the very day that I succeeded in getting this bill through the Senate, and it went through on the second, passed on second reading at 30%. We were very impressed, very pleased, and but a whole bunch of the legislators came up to me right away after the session ended. We've got to do something to make sure that some of that money from the tax on coal is set aside for future generations. Because what happens when the coal is gone? It's a valuable resource. Montana's the treasure state. What are we going to have to show for it when the treasure is gone? And they said, let's set up a trust fund. Miles Romney, Chet Blaylock, Pat Regan, a whole bunch of others all came around me and they said, we've got to do something about that. So fine, I drafted a bill, and it would put on the ballot at the next election a constitutional amendment that would provide for 50% of all the money that we collected on that coal severance tax would go into a trust fund. And that trust fund would be perpetually available forever. The interest income could be used every year by the legislature to fund government or whatever the legislature chose, but it would always, but they couldn't touch the principal unless, and I put in this number, you get a 3/4 vote of each house of the legislature.
Oh,
Now that's hard to get.
yes.
If it's controversial, if it's not controversial, that's not a problem. But if it's controversial, that's hard to get. And in fact, that was put on the ballot. It was adopted. It is now part of the law. And that fund is now over $1 billion. And it produces a huge amount of money that does help the legislature and help state government, all of state government. And it has, and it will continue to do so forever and ever. And I'm very proud of that. I think that that's something that this group of people really pushed really hard to do, and I was a member of that, and very proud of that.
Tom, you've got the coal use tax through in Montana. What effect did that have on other states?
Well, there was a lot of interest in other states, particularly on the trust fund and the concept of setting aside some money for future generations. And I made that speech many times, not only to the people in Montana before the tax was adopted, before the trust fund was adopted, but all over the country. I was asked by people to come. I went to Alaska, but the governor of Alaska asked me to come to Alaska and talk to a seminar there. I went to Kentucky. I went to Pennsylvania. The coal miners in Pennsylvania were concerned about it and wanted to know about it. I went to Colorado. The legislators in Colorado asked me about it, and a number of places. One of the things that I always say is that Montana is the treasure state. We used to have this huge treasure in hard rock minerals, copper, silver, gold, and most of that especially the copper, is gone now out of Butte. Richest hill on earth is no longer producing that much copper. What do we have to show for it? Well, I looked around to see what I could find, and I found out that even the copper kings, the people who made huge amounts of money on copper in Butte, didn't leave their money to Butte or to Montana. In fact, I looked, and the most I could find was that Marcus Daly left $10,000 to build a theater inside the walls of the state prison.
Oh, is that right?
Now,
And that's it?
I've since that time learned that he also left some money for a scholarship at the University of Montana, but very little. And I said, now we've got this vast resource of coal. We have something like a fourth of the nation's coal supply. 52% of the low sulfur coal in Montana. And we have, that's something like an eighth of the world's coal supply in Montana. We have this vast treasure. We are not going to let that treasure get away again without saving something for our future generations, so that our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren can look us in the eye and say, and we can tell them and say, no, we did not squander that treasure. We have a trust fund, and it will always be there for your help and your children's help and everyone's help. That's what we did. And I made that pitch to a lot of other states. And I think there is some interest in trust funds, but unfortunately, at least my experience is that they didn't protect it with the Constitution like we did. When we put in a 3/4 vote of each house of the legislature in order to tap the principle, that made a difference. Wyoming had a fund. They used it. We set up another fund, by the way. We had a fund. I set that up as a part of what I call the pie. Where does the other 50% go? 50% goes into the trust fund. We made a pie as to where all the rest of the funds went. And a big portion of it, something like 20% of that pie, we set aside for higher education in Montana. Very important. And we set that up in a trust fund for higher education. Very significant. Well, guess what? About the time I left the legislature, the legislature was really short of money. And we got to look around and see whether we can find some money to keep the state going and to build the library in Butte and to do all these other things that really need to be done. Well, they took it. It was right after I was unelected. They took that trust fund. It was over $100 million. There is no trust fund for education today. And that's what happened not only in Montana but all over the country. But the Constitutional Trust Fund will always remain because it's protected by the Constitution, and you have to have a 3/4 vote of each house of the legislature to touch that Constitutional Trust Fund. And we've set up an organization, Montanans for the Coal Trust, and we meet every other year, and we do some lobbying. We contact the legislators and make sure they understand the importance of that trust fund.
And would such a bill pass now?
No, probably not.
But
I think that what you were asking really is, why is Montana, which is now known as a conservative red state, how did it ever happen that it had some of this real progressive legislation?
yes, that's what I'm.
But I need to, I think, call your attention back to the fact that Montana always has had a progressive background. Back in the early days, in the early part of the century, of the 20th century, when politics was just getting started, we had a lot of very progressive politics in Montana. We had organizations, not only the labor unions out of Butte, and since Butte was the major city, it was the biggest city between Minneapolis and Seattle. It was the town, it was the area, and it was a coal mine, and it was mostly miners, and they were union. And that was a very important factor. But it wasn't just that. We had a lot of the farmers
Farmers Union.
Farmers Union was a major one, but
Clifford Stokes.
but there were others as well. Farmers Union was very, very significant. But even before the Farmers Union, there were labor organizations that were farm organizations that were very active and very, very progressive. Up in Sheridan County, furthest northeast corner of the state, they actually had some socialist legislators and had some socialist elected officials. They were very, very much involved in the farm groups. And that tradition, in North Dakota had the same thing, by the way.
Well, what was the strength of the nonpartisan league?
The Nonpartisan League was what I'm talking about, right? That was one of the organizations, and they, and that I think set us up a little differently from a lot of the other states in this area, and I think that helped also. But when I think we came in the beginning of that decade, of the early 70s, the 1970s, I was first elected in 1970. And a number of the other legislators came in at that same time, and in the early 70s, we did have a majority, and that was right when the environmental movement was becoming very strong. It was just getting a hold, and that plus all of the other things that happened, we had a very progressive legislature. It was, as I call it, the silent revolution. We did a huge amount of things in this state that has never happened since. And will that ever come back? I don't know. Over the years, we've gradually lost it, like it has happened in other areas. More and more people are voting conservative. And not only that, but just since with the impact of Trump, President Trump, I think the whole politics is changing, and I see that in Montana in particular. We used to say that the Democrats in Montana and in elsewhere were labor, were farmers, were low-income people, probably not very well educated for the most part, and those who tended to be wealthy and business people and large entrepreneurs, and generally a lot of the more intelligent people tended to vote Republican. Well, that's changing. And Donald Trump is now appealing to the working people, the less educated people, and the people who, the poorer people. What's happening is that there's a change so that now more intelligent people tend to be voting Democratic. More and more of the wealthier people are voting Democratic, and that whole concept is different. In Billings, for instance, where we live here, where we are right now, just north of the Rimrocks, solid Republican, always been solid Republican. You never have a chance to get elected in this area. My district was down where I used to live, and it was more of the working class, more of the probably less intelligent, probably the poorer people, probably people who really struggled in their life. That's not the case anymore. Those people tend to vote Republican. These people up here tend to vote Democratic. That's happening, and that's what's going on.
We had a very similar response from Bob Brown, who you knew well, and we had a wonderful interview with him, which you can read on YouTube. But I'm interested in another aspect that I think you were interested in, which is social justice, and particularly the Montana criminal system, prisons and so forth. Have you any sense of how that has evolved since you were in the Senate?
Yes, that used to be a very significant thing that I was very, very much interested in. I guess that started even before I got into the legislature. I went over, while I was in law school in Missoula, went over to the prison in Deer Lodge on a number of occasions, interviewed the prison wardens, and I looked and found out that, this is very strange. Most of the wardens were former deputy sheriffs or somebody in law enforcement. They weren't trained or educated in criminology at all. And they really weren't focusing on rehabilitation. They had a school system that was, I think, very poorly done when I first started. And this was in the middle 60s. 1960s, and at one point there was a huge riot, and you probably have heard about that, and it was really pretty serious, and a number of people around the state said, we've got to change this system. They got together and they got a committee going. I think the governor appointed a committee. I don't remember the details. At any rate, they came up with the recommendation of a new warden who really had a background in criminology, who had knowledge and background in prison management. And Warden Powell did it, and he was named as a warden. And he brought some very significant reforms to the prison. When I was in law school, I remember going down to interview Warden Powell, and I was just talking to him about how the things that he'd done in the prison and all that, and for a radio program. When I got back to Missoula, was listening to the news, the governor fired the warden that day, the day I was there. What happened? What's this all about? And what they did was they appointed a deputy sheriff as a warden. And I was just appalled at that and wondered what in the world is going on. So yes, I had some concerns about what was happening in prisons in Montana. And I didn't have a lot to do with it. I was involved in a lot of the juvenile, the laws regarding juvenile delinquency in the state of Montana, and I worked on that, introduced some bills there. I was on the Crime Control Board for a short period of time. I was involved in a number of other things. One of the things that I think I did probably have some impact on was the probation officers. That is still a big problem, but when I first came, most of the probation officers also didn't have any background or education. Most of them didn't have a college education. And I did, I think, something that was fairly effective. I introduced a bill that said anybody who works as a probation and parole system that gets a college education would be able to have a particular increase in their salary. A bill didn't pass, but it worked. Everybody, all these people who were in the probation office at that time said, I got to figure out how to get some more education. They did. And it was I think, very effective. Well, I think we have a very, very good and talented group of probation officers now. We still don't fund them enough. That's still an area that we need to work on harder. And we still need to work more on that. But again, we were trying to move the prison system away from this idea of lock them up and don't worry about it. We want to get them rehabilitated. Most of the prisoners are going to come back in society. When they come back in society, are they just going to reoffend and then go back into prison, or are we going to get somewhere? Are we going to make some progress? Well, that's not easy, and it takes a long time, and it's quite an effort, but I think we've done a lot of that. Part of that whole system was, should we build a new prison? The prison at that time in Deer Lodge, right in the middle of the town, not a very well located prison for sure. It was an old prison. There were complaints about people who were put in the hole and would one person died when they were in the hole, and there were some other similar things like that. I took it seriously. When I was in the legislature, I would, every time I got a chance, I would go to Deer Lodge and visit the prison, always unannounced, and I always insisted on going to the hole. I want to see what's going on there. One day, I remember I came, it was about 6 o'clock at night, and the deputy warden was taking me around and showing me things, and I wanted to go to the hole, and I got to the hole, and at that point was some cells that were where they didn't have any access to anybody else, and this one guy came and said, "Oh, you got to turn off this music. I can't stand this music." There wasn't any music. He was totally out of it.
Oh my gosh.
And the next day, I wrote to the department head, Department of Corrections. I said, "We've got people in the prison who are clearly mentally ill and delusional. And what are you doing about it?" They got him out of there right away. Well, I think that's a little bit of an indication of what we can do. And if we would put more money and more emphasis on probation and parole and getting people out into the community, I think we'd have less concern about prison. Interestingly enough, I opposed the new prison. Everybody wanted to build a new prison. I said, you build a bigger prison and they'll fill it up. That's the way it works. You don't want people in prison. You want to get them out in society so that they can produce and be productive members of society. But you got to make sure they're not going to commit a crime first. So let's work on that. And you can work on that. Well, I opposed. In fact, I circulated a petition and I got over 51% of the legislators in the House signed my petition. Don't build a prison. We've had study after study after study, and they all say, don't build a prison, you just increase the population. Well, the prison bill got through anyway, and we built a prison. And I remember the day I went up to the legislature. It was it wasn't during the session, and I went up to the to hear about the opening of the bids for the new prison. The day they opened the bids for the new prison was the day they had the least number of people in the prison in the state of Montana ever. 272 people. And what do they have now? Over 2,000, close to 3,000 people.
Oh my gosh.
And that's not helping. That's not helping the system.
One follow-up, and then I'll quit along this line. There's always been a concern by people with concern about justice, about Native American proportionate in the prison. Was that ever an issue you got into or continue to follow?
It was, and you can't take everything. You can't do everything, but there are certain little things that you can do something with. One of the things that I worked with Polly Holmes on this. She was very interested in this. Was do we have teachers in the education system, in the school system, that have a background in Indians, so that they, Indian culture, Indian things, so that they can be more receptive and do a better job in teaching. And we sponsored a bill and got it passed. I helped her. I think she was the chief sponsor. I did much of the drafting, and I pushed it through both houses of the legislature, that required any school on or within, I can't remember, I think it was 100 miles of a reservation. The teachers all would have to have some background in their educational background, some courses in Indian studies. I thought that was very important. It wasn't too long after it passed, by the way, that the schools, teachers don't like to be told what they should take as coursework and what they should be taught as coursework, so it got repealed. But we do now have still some focus on that, and yes, there are requirements that you have to have some background in Indian culture to teach them on that.
And that's statewide, isn't it?
That's statewide now. So so yes, I have gotten into that a little bit. As an attorney, I have done more, I suspect, in that area. I was counsel for the Crow tribe for a while. When Clara Nomi was chairman, I was her lawyer, her chief counsel. I also was counsel for the Northern Cheyenne tribe. I've had a lot of cases on the Fort Peck Reservation and on the Blackfeet Reservation and the Belknap Reservation. I have done a fair amount of work with the tribal courts.
Do most of the tribes now have their own tribal member lawyer?
Many of them do. The Crow does, and many of them do. Yes, I think that's also true. The courts, I can remember the regional director told me once, and I think that's fairly accurate. He says, you know, the tribal courts, if they figured out a way to get some money to put into the tribal courts, more than what is provided by the BIA and the regular system, the tribal courts aren't too bad. But if they don't get a little extra money, they're really not very good.
Okay.
And there still is that problem. The justice system on the reservation is difficult. The governmental system is a challenge in most areas, but it's getting better. It's getting better in one way that I think we should all be proud of, and that is the Indians themselves are taking a much stronger hold of their own future.
Okay.
And I can remember when I first started practicing law, they used to tell me about how, well, the superintendent would come around and he would go to the tribal council meetings and he would say, well, now here's our agenda and here's what you need to do. And then I'd just go ahead and say, yes, okay. And yes, we vote for that. Yes, yes. Now, this superintendent doesn't dare go to those tribal council meetings anymore because those people take their own rules and their own regulations seriously, and they do their own job. I think that's good. So we're advancing, but there's a long ways to go.
In the 1970s, you beat Montana Power Company, which was really powerful in Montana. Now it's disappeared, and I'm wondering, was that you had mentioned that Montana has now become much more conservative. Is this related at all to the loss of Montana Power Company, or?
I don't think so. I don't think there's much connection there. There may be something, but not much. The history of Montana is a fascinating history, and I'm sure you're well aware of that. But the Anaconda Company ended up buying out all the other mining companies in Butte and became the dominant company. And then, you know, I tell a story about, I think it was the 1902 when they were having some trouble. The Anaconda Company was having some trouble with the courts, and Heinze was one of the copper kings that hadn't been bought out yet. And Heinze had this theory, the apex theory, that if the the copper seam ended up on your property when it came out of the soil, you could follow that as far as you wanted, no matter whose land it went under. And the Anaconda Company said, that is not valid law. And Clancy was the judge, and they had brought it to Clancy's court, and Clancy was another very interesting person, but the bottom line was they could not get the Heinze out of their land because he was underneath their land digging out their coal, their ore, their copper ore, and they finally just gave up with Clancy, and Clancy would fall asleep on the bench and he'd say, "Hey, Judge, we need a ruling." He said, "Heinze wins." You know, that was the kind of things that at least the stories go. So they went to Governor Toole, and they said, the Anaconda Company, they said, "We need you to call a special session of the legislature because we need to pass a bill that will allow us to disqualify a judge who we can't get along with." Governor Toole said, "You're out of your mind. I can't call a special session of the legislature. That's a private matter. That's not something we can do." And they said, "Okay." And they had a closeout. They had a lockout. They controlled something like a third of the non-agricultural employment in the state of Montana at that time, because it wasn't just the copper mines, it was the utilities, it was the water people, and it was, you know, the newspapers. They got the newspapers too, all except for the Great Falls Tribune, and they got a lot of other businesses in the state. They had a huge amount, and after a couple months, Governor Toole came back and said, "All right, I guess we got to do it." So they called a special session of the legislature, and they passed a disqualification bill. Now, as a lawyer, I have to say that was probably one of the best bills that ever got passed, because you do need to disqualify a judge once in a while when they just get out of hand. But for a private company to do that is wrong. And unfortunately, ever since that time, the legislature was in total control of the Anaconda Company for the first 50 years of the 20th century. And K. Ross Toole tells this story, and I think it's a great story. K. Ross Toole got appointed as director of the Historical Society. That's a state institution in Montana. And he tells this story. He says that he needed a new machine. You know, that was back before the days of the photocopiers. I think 1947, back before the days of the photocopying machines. And it was a big machine, and he needed it for some purpose on handling the affairs of the Montana Historical Society. And so it was, you know, not a big deal, $20,000 or $30,000, which was a lot of money, but not a big deal, obviously. He went through the procedure, he went through the budgeting process for the agency and through the governor's office, and they got it introduced as House Bill 3 in the legislature, and then they followed through the committees and everything, and he said, you know, things are going fine. And then finally one day, the Anaconda Company lobbyist said, "We got to talk." And so they sat down and visited. He brought all his stuff and he made his pitch. He said, you know, why this was so important. We got to have this machine, and we got to do this. And he says, the Anaconda lobbyist said, "Okay." He says, "I went out and bought the machine. going through the legislature is just a formality after that. That's what happened in this state. The legislature may tell stories about how they would people would drop things down from on a string into the legislative
Right.
hall and all those kinds of things. But was it the 7th floor of the Placer Hotel was always open, almost 24 hours, I think. Anytime a legislator wanted something to eat or drink, especially to drink, I guess, they would go up there. If you wanted to get a bill drafted by the legislature, you'd go to the 7th floor of the Placer Hotel, which is where the Anaconda Company's offices were, of course, and they would be happy to draft a bill for you. And you know, if you didn't get some expertise in drafting your bill, you didn't have much of a chance to get it through the legislature. They controlled the thing. They controlled the legislature totally. That started to disappear in the early 50s. And by the time I got there in the 70s, it was mostly gone. There was no 7th floor in the Placer Hotel anymore. There was no, the Anaconda Company and had been largely replaced by the Montana Power Company. You know, the Montana Twins, as
Gold Dust Twins.
what's his name now? I can't think of it. I'll think of it in a minute. At any rate, the journalist from Great Falls wrote this story about the Montana Twins, talking about the Anaconda Company and the Montana Power Company. And they went through, the Montana Power Company, by the time I got to the legislature, was the dominant company. They didn't ever have the power that the Anaconda Company had, but the Montana Power Company had a lot of power and a lot of influence, and they were a huge impact. They were very careful and very methodical in how they handled it. They would put on a retainer, a lawyer in virtually every community, whose job was to keep pulse of the community, just to let them know what was going on, to make sure that they were on top of things. And they had a huge impact. Their lobbyists, they had a Democratic lobbyist and a Republican lobbyist. The Democratic lobbyist lobbied the Democrats, the Republicans. It was a full-time job. They went around, this was when I was there, they went around the state and contacted all the legislative candidates. As soon as they were elected, they were on top of it. They knew them by their first name. They were very good at it. And that's what we saw when we first came. And there were a lot of us younger legislators, at that time I was younger, that were saying, hey, that's not the way government's supposed to operate. We shouldn't do that. We need to separate ourselves from that. I didn't go to parties with the Anaconda Company. I didn't hang out with the Anaconda Company or the Montana Power Company. And most of the other people who got elected, the young legislators in the beginning 70s, 1970s, were the same. And that's what I refer to as what the silent revolution was, a huge impact on Montana. And it really did have an impact. We haven't ever gone back that far and done that much for the people of Montana since.
Tom, there's some people arguing that is happening now, this year, with the women's movement, the success of a number of female candidates, all from the Democratic side. Do you think that's afoot? Do you feel that movement?
I think one could argue that yes, there is some similarities, and yes, there is something going on. I think yes, there can be, and just like we were talking a little bit ago about how there's a change. I think that you're right. The women's groups have had a big impact, and I think they'll have an even bigger impact. I think you're absolutely right. We're going to see more of that. I think we're starting to see that same thing in a lot of legislative candidates right now who are saying, hey, this way that things have been happening in the past is wrong. We need to change it. We need to be more democratic in
Small d.
d sense. We need to be more concerned about the people who we represent. And I think there's a lot of similarities to what we had back in the 70s, in the 1970s.
You found that view shared among your neighbors who used to be Republicans and now are Democrats?
I don't know.
In your neighborhood, or have you done a canvass? Or
No, I think what I would have to say there is that I see a lot of people who are Republicans who are saying, no, I can't go on this way. I'm going to vote Democratic. I am going to support so-and-so, or I'm going to support this idea or this concept. Yes, I see some of that. Is it as powerful as it was back then? I don't know. I'm not sure. The one thing that I think you've got to recognize is that it takes a long time for some of those things to change. I used to think that, fine, we got a Republican session. This session, we got a Republican control of the legislature. That isn't going to last. We're going to, it's cycles. We go back and forth, and we'll be back in power after a while, and it generally happens. But we don't have that progressive, that people concern that we had in the 70s. And I'm not sure we have all of it, but I think there's more indication of that than we've had for a long time. I would say that, yes. And my wife was just mentioning another factor that is true and that is a very big item. One of the reasons that so many people seem to be going conservative is that they get wrapped up in their own environment. Fox News, they don't listen to anything else but Fox News. And Fox News has this totally biased sense of all of the facts, of all of the information, and it makes it very difficult if you can't get some of those people to listen to some of the other facts, the other things that are happening, which shows totally that Fox News is just totally wrong. But if they don't listen to it, you're not going to get anywhere. Well, that's gone. I don't know how to replace that. The civility in the legislature is gone. I'll bet Bob Brown mentioned that. Bob and I, by the way, started at exactly the same time in the 1971 session.
Right.
And we moved over to the Senate at exactly the same time. And we did a lot of things together, and I have a great deal of respect for Bob. Went to his wedding when he got married over at Forsyth. I did, and visit him often. In any event, there are a lot of people who I think are also very disturbed and very concerned that we don't have the civility that we used to have. For instance, we would oftentimes have very vigorous debates in the Senate, or the House for that matter, and we would just, go all out to try and make our points. But that didn't mean we didn't respect the people who were on the other side. And, I have a great deal of respect for some of the people who opposed me on the amount of the severance tax, who said the severance tax was too high and they would make every effort they possibly could to change it. But I respected them. We got along great. We respected each other.
No.
That respect is gone. We don't see that in the legislature now, and that's unfortunate. And it's because the people they're compartmentalized their whole lives. They don't really get out and see the other side. And that's unfortunate. They're not willing to accept and listen and then make a decision. They just hear the facts they want to hear, and that's it. That's too bad. That's unfortunate, but I think that's happening. Now, I think that with Trump, people are so upset, so many people are so upset, especially the more intelligent ones, especially the younger people, that there's going to be a change. And that's not going to prevail forever, but it's going to take a long time. And it won't be just this election. It won't be, there won't be huge changes in this election, nor the next election. Maybe the third time down the road, we might get somewhere.
2022, that will be our target to look for.
Well, maybe even longer than that.
Okay.
I was chairman of the taxation committee, and I was totally unaware of a bill that came before the committee one day, and it was a bill that would allow a special exception to the inheritance tax collected by the state of Montana at that time. It's been since repealed. That would have devastated the Daley Mansion, because the Daley Mansion was a very expensive, was a very big asset, and when the lady that was in charge.
This is in Hamilton, right?
This is in, well, the Daley Mansion is, yes, this is in Hamilton.
No.
Let's see, that was William Clark's
No,
son, daughter, granddaughter, any rate.
Marcus Daly.
Oh, it's Marcus Daly. I got the wrong one. Sorry. Anyway, Marcus Daly's granddaughter, I think it was, just died, and she's, there's been quite a bit of story about her. In any event, at that point, it sounded like she was going to have to pay a huge amount of money because of that Daley Mansion, which was a fairly expensive asset at that time. And they came in with this bill that would say we would forgive some of that if you will set that aside, Daley Mansion aside, for the public, and make that a public asset, and allow people to go in and visit it. Well, I said, if that works for the Daley Mansion, why wouldn't that work for the Moss Mansion here in Billings? And in fact, it did, because I knew that it was at about that same time that the last one of the Moss heirs was about to die, and there would be a similar issue. And so I simply amended the bill, very, very small amendment, to include the Moss Mansion. And the bill passed, and it was a very, very beneficial thing. We did get, in fact, the Preservation Society now with the ownership of the Moss Mansion and a combination of the city and the state, and it has been worked out very effectively, very well, and it's a very, very big asset, a nice tourist attraction in Billings. And my wife Ruth was the director of the Moss Mansion for 10 years. So 15 years, she says. Okay, 15 years. And that was an accomplishment. That was nice.
Yes. And that was, what about the Bear family? Is that included, or?
No, it wasn't included in that, and that was a different issue, a different situation, and a different time element that came up. Alberta Bear died quite a bit later, and tax issues there were some tax issues, yes. They did get some benefits, but it wasn't as big a benefit as the Daley Mansion and the Moss Mansion. So that was helpful.
And the trust fund was composed of some of the inheritance tax money that.
No, the trust fund didn't have anything to do with that.
Oh.
It didn't come out of the trust fund, but it was a separate situation. It was a provision in which the state of Montana agreed to reduce their taxes by a certain amount, inheritance taxes, if they would set aside this building for the public ownership and public use.
Okay.
And the only way they could do that was to get the legislature to agree, because the system wasn't set up otherwise. And it worked. And it worked very well.
There's a related issue that both of you and your wife may have been interested in, which is so impressive to me, which is the new city library. And I was there for the first time in my life yesterday. Bill Cochran is a friend of David's and mine.
Oh, good.
And so he came down and took me around and pointed out some of the features. that caused the entire country to come to Billings to see that library and get into the background. So I'm curious as to how the leadership in this town got together to create such a institution.
Well, don't don't write off the citizens of this state or this city. I think they have some very good public concerns, and that's certainly one of them. And that's not only the only one either. I mean, they supported the dealer park, the baseball park. They passed a bond issue for that as well. They passed a bond issue for the building of the new library. The people all got together, the business community, the citizens communities, the people all joined together to work for that library, and they got it passed. The people supported it and voted for the bond issue, and then it became possible. And yes, it's quite a remarkable building, isn't it? We're very proud of it.
I'm proud of the Seattle Library. It's worth a trip to Seattle to see it. That also got global attention. And the librarians who work there are not quite as happy with it as those of us who come and visit. But nonetheless, it's a profound transformation of what a library can do in a community and what benefit ongoing learning can be when you have such a place.
Right. Well, I think that indicates that yes, that there is a role for government, and we've heard for a long time now how what we've got to do is reduce government. You know, Ronald Reagan made that statement about how the best government is the smallest government, and we've got to cut out all this bureaucracy, and we've got to cut out all these regulations, and we've got to have less government. And the smallest government is the best government. That has, I think, led us astray. Government exists for the purpose of helping the people. And yes, when it doesn't help the people, we need to reform it. But when it's doing its job, like in a library that's really needed, or like in something that can be enjoyed by the people, or is needed by the people, prison reform, which is needed by the people, taking care of the people and the people's interests, then I think we need to look to government, because the government can do a lot. And we need to be creative in making sure at the same time we don't overdo it, or that we don't put too much money in a particular area. But don't forget, the bottom line is that government can help people, and we need to make sure that we do that.
Recently, the Montana legislature expanded Medicaid,
Right.
and that was more reliance upon government.
That's right.
How did that happen in today's political atmosphere?
I think that you should never forget that Montana has a progressive background, a progressive history, that there always have been people in Montana that are concerned about making sure government works for the people. And I think that's a part of it. It probably wouldn't have happened ever in Wyoming, or even in North Dakota, although North Dakota has a progressive background too, maybe not as strong, I don't know. But yes, that's very significant, and that's a good illustration of that. Governor Bullock got that through the legislature, and not all states went along, and some states are hurting pretty bad. Now they really want it, and they're going to, they've been behind. But yes, Montana, I think, is more enlightened and more concerned about making sure government works for the people. And sometimes the only way you can get something done, in this case, the medical care for the least wealthy people of the state, that can help very well.
And so you saw solid support in the public for this issue?
I wouldn't say solid support, no, but I would say support, a lot of support, and it therefore was enough to get the legislature to adopt it. And yes, It's solid. I don't think it's going to be repealed. I think it's going to be good. Now, the big question is, are they going to renew it? That's coming up this next session of legislature. I think they will, because I have confidence in the people of the state of Montana. I really think that they will recognize that when something is good and works and does a good job for the people, even if it costs money, we got to do it. And that's one of the things we've got to do.
Will that be an issue in the election this fall?
Yes, I think it will. I hope it will. I think it should be. I think every legislator should be asked that question. Do you support expansion or a continuation of the Medicaid program in the state of Montana? I think that's one of the biggest issues every legislator has to face.
You had mentioned that the people are separating into their groups, and that there was a lack of civility in the legislature as compared to the past. But the Medicaid expansion required a bipartisan effort. How did that happen?
Okay, that's a different story, and that is, I think, a very interesting story. I guess that's a little bit of the history of the relationship between the governor and the legislature in the state of Montana. And we've had for the last several years, some very good Democratic governors. That's made a big difference. However, Democratic governors can't do a whole lot if they have all Republican legislators or Republican-controlled legislators. So what do? Brian Schweitzer was very good at public relations, and he was very good at pointing out just dichotomies that were weird and areas that needed to be changed and things that needed to be done. But he didn't have as good a relationship with individual legislators. Steve Bullock doesn't have the flair that Brian Schweitzer had, but he does have a pretty good way of getting along with a lot of legislators. And I think that that's a part of it. I think that a part of it is the way he approached it and the way the legislature approached the Medicaid expansion. It didn't happen the first session it came up, and it wasn't easy, but he did get enough people to support it. And it passed. And I think there's a number of other things that are the same way, that will be passed if they are really important enough. It's an awful lot of strategy. I've been reading a lot here lately of some of the biographies of George Washington, Cernos Washington, for instance, and Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Jackson, Andrew Jackson, and even James K. Polk, Abraham Lincoln, all of them. They all had difficulties with the legislature, and that's the way the system is supposed to work. That's fine. Some of them did a really good job, some of them didn't. I think that's what's so fascinating about our democracy, that we do have an opportunity to get things done, and some people are simply better at it than others. And I have to admire Andrew Jackson. I can't imagine how he got as much popularity as he did, and some of the terrible things he did about Indians. But nevertheless, he got a lot of things done, and he just totally changed this whole country. Well, that can happen even in a lesser area too. If you get the right person at the right time, they can have a huge impact on the state.
When you were having such success in the legislature in the 1970s, did governors have a role?
Oh, you bet. Tom Judge was a governor most of the time, and Ted Swindon was also, and they were very, very supportive in many of these things. Not all. I had some really strong disagreements with Tom Judge and Ted Swindon as well, and for the most part they supported the right things, and we got things done, and the governor was not an impediment. The governor went along for the most part. There were some things that the governor vetoed one of my environmental bills, giving citizens the right to sue for environmental damages when the government made the wrong decision, which Michigan had, and I was very upset with that. But maybe he was right, I don't know, in the long run. In any event, and I very, very vigorously was opposed to Ted Swindon's efforts. He wanted to make just a little teeny crack in the severance tax. He wanted to say, well, we just give a little break for special companies and where there's special concerns. We should give them a break. And we all said, don't do that. You let them get the foot in the door, and they'll go wild. He got his bill passed, and the next session they dropped the tax down to 15%. I was very upset with that.
Yes.
But and he was not in favor of reducing the tax like that at all. But he made a mistake, I think, of going that far. So, but by and large, yes, the governors did support us.
Tom, you've given a good illustration of the role you played and a few colleagues in the 70s of getting progressive legislation through. The Medicaid example is important in my mind, not only for Montana, but the nation as a whole. There are some states that are purple, as they say, neither blue nor red. Montana, to my mind, is a little more purple than most people give it credit for.
Right.
And I think one of the reasons is for some years now there have been a few moderate Republicans who maybe are playing a role somewhat like you played, although the Democrats were really dominant in the 70s. And my sense is we interviewed a fellow named Lou Jones out of Conrad.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And he claimed to have played a role in the Medicaid, getting it through.
Very much so. Very much so.
So there's a big issue. We interviewed one of the local gals who just got nominated by the Democrats to become a state legislator here in Billings. And she's very concerned about the cutback in the Medicaid. Mm-hmm. And I asked her if she knew much about Lou Jones and didn't get a response. But she's brand new to politics, so she hadn't had a chance to study much. Do you have a sense that Jones can play a role, and he has a couple Republican colleagues who can get Medicaid back on track?
Absolutely. I very, very much think so. I have a great deal of respect for Jones. I have for Senator Jones. I don't always agree, of course,
Right.
but he has made a huge impact on things. He is somebody you can go to and will listen. And I think that's good, and I think that's very helpful. And yes, when the Democrats are in the minority, you've got to have some Republicans or you can't get anything passed.
Right.
And if you don't, you're in trouble. And so you've got to do that. Now, the other side of the coin is, I've been there and I've seen it, that when the Democrats are in control, there are going to be some Democrats that you're going to lose. And they're not always going to stick with you. Yeah. And we had that happen a lot. And that's the way the politics operates. And I don't have any problem with, I think, we generally get things done because there are enough people that really are supportive of the main thing. If we had the civility back, I think it would be much more effective, because we'd have a lot more Republicans supporting really good measures, Democrats supporting Republican bills, which are really good measures, and the system would work a lot better. Let me tell you, there's one more story I should tell you that I think is maybe the greatest one of all. We had a great deal of frustration in 1974. Because that was the year we were getting a lot of the legislation on environment passed. We made some huge strides in the environment. But we also lost a lot of the bills, and particularly that was the year that the coal tax bill lost. And the frustrating point was that we got it through the House, and it went over to the Senate. And the Senate was 30 Democrats and 20 Republicans. We had a very substantial majority. And we lost the bill. And we lost a lot of environmental bills. We were just terribly frustrated. So what did we do? As I think I mentioned earlier, a whole bunch of us got together, got filed for the Senate. We said, we're going to change things. We're going to go into that body and do something different. And we got elected. I got elected. Mike Greeley got elected. Chet Blaylock got elected. Pat Regan got elected. We had, that's just a few of them. We counted up. We still had 30 Democrats. And we counted up the number of votes, and we added Miles Romney, who was from Hamilton, was with us. He was not with the other Democrats, the old conservative Democrats. We had 19. They had 11. So Larry Fassbender and I got together one day before the session, and we said, we ought to get together and kind of organize and see what we can make sure if we have that many people, we ought to be able to do something. So we did, and I had a key to one of the taxation committee rooms, or one of the rooms in the 4th floor of the Capitol building, and so we said, well, we'll get the word out to our people and make sure they come to the meeting, and we'll see what we can do. Every single Democratic senator was there at that meeting. They heard about it. They all came because they were worried. And we said, here's what we'd like to do. We want the chairmanships of the important committees. We want the taxation committee, Bob Watt. We want the judiciary committee, that was mine. We want the natural resources committee. We want all the important committees. And we said, fine, we'll let you have the president and the majority leader. We understand you had some time in the legislature. I can remember some of those, Paul Boylan and Dave Manning at that time, who joined with us later, years later. And some of the others looked at us and said, but you're a freshman. You can't be chairman. We said, all right, we'll do our own thing then. And one thing I always have given them credit for, they can count. And guess what? We got the chairmanships that we asked for. Paul Boylan was just furious. He said, I have been on that education committee for all these years, and now you want to give it to Pat Regan, who's a freshman. Or it wasn't Pat Regan, somebody else. Anyway, you want to give it to a freshman. You can't do that. And we said, well, Paul, did you support this bill in the last session? Well, no. Did you support this bill? No. Did you support this bill? No. Well, now do you see why we want to have our chairman? He didn't like it very well, but they could count. They went along with us, and that happened. I was made chairman of the Committee on Committees, so I got to pick I had Miles Romney, who was with me all the way, and Carol Graham. And Carol recognized right away that Carol was a senator from Hardin. He recognized right away that he was outvoted. So I virtually picked the entire committee system, and it was my first term in the Senate.
But they all knew you from your time in the House, right?
And I got to select all the people, all the seats, the seating arrangements, and that was very significant. I didn't allow anybody on the Senate Taxation Committee until I knew how they were going to vote on the coal tax. Bob Brown served on the coal tax committee that year. He says, "Why did you appoint me? I said, because you were going to vote right. And he did. And that's why we got a lot of things done that session, the 1975 session, because we did have the control. And the older, more conservative senators who were repeatedly voting against these good progressive bills, we dominated, and that's how it happened.
When I was working in the legislature in the 50s, Dave Manning was very quiet. And
okay, Dave Manning was, he was very interested. Yes, he voted no on all those things in '74. And then I made a point. My wife made a good point once. She said, you don't, when you're dealing with somebody that you don't get along with, that doesn't vote the way you do, sit beside him. Don't sit across the table. Don't sit down the table. Sit right beside him. So I made a point of sitting right beside Dave Manning. And I've worked with him a lot. And he changed totally on the coal tax. And he has one of the best quotes on this coal tax, I think. He was very, very big on highways. He was a construction contractor, and he built highways, and he was always very concerned about highways. And he said that, well, when the bill came in '75 session, he supported me I got him to agree with me, and he supported me on the coal tax. And he said, these lobbyists for the coal companies came around and told me, you shouldn't support that. That'll kill the whole industry. The coal will be in trouble. You shouldn't do that. And he said, well, I told them that I don't know whether you're right or wrong, but if you leave the state of Montana, you're going to leave on a good highway. I love that. So things changed, and yes, I ended up being very close to Dave Manning. I worked with him a lot in the last years that he served, and I sat beside him all the time, and took his seat after he left.
oh, good. Well, we have had quite an interview here. We thank you very much. And a lot of insights that you have provided us.
Well, I hope it was helpful.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Well,
it was a
that's
real
good.
pleasure to be with you. It brought back memories I'd forgotten about.
Is that right? Well, it's sure good to talk to you folks. Okay.